It can be dealing all damage on them, though, you know? Like, that's cringe.
If you don't
Easy clap!
I'm going for the swanton bomb.
Oh my god.
Be patient.
He's trying. You're not ulting me, brother. Not reload.
There was a time when one free game did something almost nobody thought was possible. It challenged Overwatch, not because it had Blizzard's budget or even its polish, but because millions of players genuinely loved it. But today, most gamers barely remember it exists. Its esports scene is long gone, and its development has completely stopped. And if you ask someone under the age of 18 what Paladins is, there's a good chance they'll have absolutely no idea. So, what happened? How did one of the biggest free-to-play hero shooters slowly fade into the background while games around it kept evolving? Was it really just an Overwatch clone? Did Blizzard kill it? Did Hi-Rez abandon it? Or was Paladins always doomed from the very beginning? The strange thing is, the more I researched this game, the more I realized almost everyone remembers its story differently. Some people blame Overwatch, others blame Hi-Rez, some the bugs and some the community. And recently, people have even started trying to save it. That alone should tell you something. Games people truly don't care about don't get second chances. Nobody's trying to revive Battleborn, nobody's trying to buy Lawbreakers. Yet somehow, years after Paladin stopped being one of the biggest shooters on the market, people are still fighting over its future. Which means one thing: there had to be something special about this game. And to understand why people still refuse to let go, we have to go back. Let's go all the way back to 2016, when the entire game industry suddenly became obsessed with one genre, the hero shooter. Back in 2016, the gaming industry had a new obsession: hero shooters. Every studio wanted one. I mean, the formula seemed simple enough, right? Create a cast of memorable characters, give each one unique abilities, throw them into objective-based game modes, and you've got the next big competitive shooter. Then Blizzard released Overwatch, and almost overnight it became one of the biggest games on the planet. Critics loved it. Players loved it. It went as far to even get Game of the Year. But there was just one problem: it wasn't free. At launch, if you wanted to play Overwatch, you had to spend around $40. Now that might not sound like too much today, but back then, especially for younger players or anyone outside places like North America or Europe, $40 wasn't an impulse purchase. It was a barrier, and whenever there's a barrier, someone eventually tries to remove it. Enter Paladins. When it was first revealed, the comparisons were immediate. People looked at the colorful art style, the fantasy-inspired heroes, the objective-based gameplay, and the internet reached a conclusion almost instantly: it's just a free Overwatch clone. That label spread incredibly fast. In fact, for a lot of people, that reputation stuck before they had even played a single match. And honestly, I can't even blame them. If you looked at screenshots side by side, there were obvious similarities: a gunslinger, a giant armored knight, a stealthy flanker, a sniper. On the surface, it looked familiar. Maybe too familiar. But here's where I think history has been a little unfair to Paladins, because once people actually installed the game, something unexpected happened. They didn't just stay because it was free. They stayed because it played nothing like Overwatch. And that's where Paladins stopped being the free alternative and started becoming something entirely its own. For a lot of players, downloading Paladins was almost a joke. It's free, why not? Worst case, you uninstall it after a few matches. But that's not what happened, because the longer people played, the less it felt like they were playing Overwatch, and the more it felt like they had discovered something completely different. The biggest reason for that was freedom. In Overwatch, when you picked a hero, that was it. You learned the abilities, you mastered them, and if the match wasn't going your way, the biggest decision was switching to someone else. Paladins took a completely different approach. It asked a simple question: what if two players could pick the exact same champion and still play them differently? That's where the card system came in. Before every match, you built your own loadout. Maybe you wanted more mobility, maybe you wanted a shorter cooldown, maybe you even wanted stronger healing. Instead of forcing everyone into one version of a character, Paladins let you shape them around your own playstyle. Then once the match actually started, you weren't done making decisions, because now there was the item shop. Every game became its own little puzzle. Was the enemy healer carrying that team? Buy anti-heal. Were you constantly getting stunned? Invest in crowd control reduction. These weren't flash mechanics, they weren't the kind of features that sold trailers, but they quietly changed how every match played out. You weren't just reacting with your aim, you were adapting with your own decisions, and that made victories feel earned. Then there were the champions themselves. I guess, yeah, some of them clearly took inspiration from Overwatch. There is really no point pretending otherwise. But inspiration isn't the same thing as imitation, because once you actually got your hands on these characters, they developed personalities of their own. And Droxus was a movement king. Bomb King turned every fight into a complete chaos. Cassie rewarded precision without needing to sit across the map with the scope. Maeve flew across rooftops in ways that made mastering her feel almost limitless. Each champion wasn't just another weapon with a different skin. They had identities, strengths, weaknesses, and most importantly, a learning curve that made finally mastering them incredibly satisfying. Before long, people stopped logging in because the game was free. They logged in because they genuinely preferred how Paladins played. And for a while, that was enough. But having a great game isn't the same thing as becoming a great success. Because while players were discovering everything Paladins had to offer, something else was happening outside the game. Something that would follow Paladins for the rest of its life, and that's its reputation. Here's the thing about first impressions. Sometimes you never get a second one. Before Paladins even had the chance to prove itself, the internet had already decided what it was: pre-Overwatch clone. That phrase followed the game everywhere. It didn't matter how many champions it added. It didn't matter how different the gameplay became. It didn't matter how many hours players poured into it. For years, that label stuck, and labels are powerful because they shape the expectations before someone even picks up the controller. If you told your friends you were playing Paladins, there was a good chance someone would respond with, "Oh, isn't that just a free version of Overwatch?" The ironic part is that many of the people saying that had never actually played it, and once they did, a surprising number changed their minds. Suddenly, they weren't comparing every ability. They were talking about loadouts, about item builds, about champions like Bomb King, Maeve, and Droxus, about mechanics that simply didn't exist in Overwatch. But by then, the damage had already been done, because while Paladins was busy convincing people it wasn't a clone, Overwatch didn't have to convince anyone of anything. It had Blizzard, one of the biggest names in gaming. Every new cinematic trailer became an event. Every new hero was headline news. Professional esports organizations lined up behind it. Content creators flooded YouTube with guides, montages, and tournament highlights. Paladins never had that kind of spotlight. Instead, it relied on something much slower. Word of mouth, one friend convincing another, one streamer discovering the game, one YouTube recommendation at a time, and honestly, it worked better than you expected. Despite being called a clone, despite competing against one of the biggest companies in gaming, Paladins built a player base of millions. Think about that for a second. A smaller studio with a fraction of the budget managed to survive the exact same genre as Blizzard. That shouldn't have happened. In fact, most of its competitors didn't survive at all. Battleborn, Gigantic, Lawbreakers, one after another, they disappeared. And Paladins didn't. It kept going year after year, update after update, which raises an even bigger question. If Paladins managed to survive when so many other hero shooters couldn't, then what actually started pushing players away? Because the game didn't collapse overnight. The problems were much slower than that. At first, they were just little annoyances. If you ask 10 different Paladin players why they stopped playing, you will probably get 10 different answers. The servers were terrible, the bugs became too much, ranked wasn't worth it anymore. The game just felt unfinished. And that's exactly what made Paladins decline so difficult to notice. There wasn't one disaster, there wasn't one update that suddenly killed the game overnight. Instead, it was hundreds of little problems that on their own were easy to forgive, until one day they weren't. Take the servers for example. If you played Paladins for any decent amount of time, you've probably experienced it. Abilities not activating, shots that looked like they should have hit but somehow didn't, rubber banding, random disconnects, entire matches feeling like they were fighting the server more than the enemy team. Every online game has technical issues. Players understand that. What they don't understand is when those same problems keep coming back year after year. Then there were the bugs, and Paladins became infamous for them. Champions flying across the map, animations completely breaking. I'm pretty sure that all of us remember Tiberius's crab walk, the kind of clips that would make everyone laugh. at least the first time. But eventually the funny bugs became frustrating ones. Abilities refusing to work, visual effects disappearing, menus breaking, random crashes, features behaving differently after almost every major update. Individually, none of these problems were enough to make someone quit, but together they slowly chipped away at something much more important: confidence. Players started asking themselves very dangerous questions. If I came back next month, will this still be broken? And once people stop believing things will improve, convincing them to return becomes incredibly difficult. But here's the part I think gets overlooked. The developers weren't sitting around doing nothing. New champions did keep arriving, and of course new skins were releasing. Events continued, balance patches were still happening. From the outside it looked like Paladins was being supported. So why did so many players feel like the game was standing still? The answer was that players weren't asking for more content anymore. They were asking for something much simpler. They wanted what was already there finally worked. Imagine buying a house with a leaking roof. Now imagine, instead of fixing the leak, someone keeps showing up every month to repaint the walls. Sure, the house looks a little different. Maybe it even looks nicer, but every time it rains, water still pours through the ceiling. You stop caring about the fresh coat of paint because the real problem was never solved. And for a lot of Paladin players, that's exactly what each update started to feel like. Not bad, just focused on the wrong things. By this point, the conversation around Paladins had changed completely. People weren't asking who's the next champion. They were asking when are they finally going to fix the game. And unfortunately, that question would only become louder. By this point, Paladins didn't have a gameplay problem. At its core, the game was still incredibly fun. People weren't asking Hi-Rez to reinvent it. They were asking them to protect it. And that's where the relationship between the developers and the community slowly began to change. Because while players were asking for stability, Hi-Rez kept making decisions that felt disconnected from what the community actually wanted. One of the biggest examples was the gradual removal of features. If you played Paladins during its earlier years, you'll probably remember play of the game. At the end of every match, everyone would stop to watch one final highlight. Maybe it was an incredible flank, maybe it was a perfectly timed ultimate, maybe it was just complete luck. It wasn't an essential feature, but it gave every match a satisfying ending. But then it was gone. Not long after, the kill cam disappeared too. Again, not something that made or broke the game, but another small piece of Paladin's identity quietly vanishing. Over time, other modes and features disappeared as well. Payload, events, little touches that made the game feel bigger than just another competitive shooter. And every time something was removed, players asked the same question: why? The official explanation often came down to resources. Some features were difficult to maintain, others were causing bugs. Some simply weren't being used enough to justify continued development. And honestly, those explanations weren't unreasonable. Game development is full of difficult trade-offs. Every hour spent maintaining an old system is an hour that can be spent building something new. The problem wasn't that features were removed. The problem was what players felt they were getting in return. Because while familiar features disappeared, new champions kept arriving, new skins kept arriving, battle passes, events, cosmetics, and from the community's perspective, it started to feel like priorities had shifted, not toward making Paladins better, but towards keeping Paladins profitable. Now, to be fair, live service games need revenue. Servers aren't free, developers don't work for free. Creating cosmetics isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, some of Paladin's skins are still among most creative I've seen in any multiplayer game. But perception matters. When players are asking for server fixes and the biggest announcement is another skin collection, it sends a message. Whether that message is intentionally or not, eventually many players stopped expecting major improvements altogether. They started lowering their expectations. Then they stopped having expectations. And that's one of the hardest things for any live service game to recover from. Not anger or empathy, because angry players still care enough to complain. Apathetic players simply stop logging in. Looking back, I don't think Hi-Rez lacked talented developers. I don't even think they lacked passion. What I think they lacked was focus. Paladins already had something most studios spend years trying to create: a loyal community, a unique identity, a genuinely fun game. It didn't need constant reinvention. It needed refinement. And while players were asking for stronger foundations, the game kept building upwards instead. Eventually, the weight became impossible to ignore. Here's what I find most fascinating about Paladins. For years, the conversation around the game became increasingly negative. People complained about bugs, about servers, about matchmaking, balance, Hi-Rez, and yet they kept playing. At first, that sounds contradictory. If a game is really that frustrating, why not just quit? The answer is surprisingly simple, because people weren't staying for the company, they were staying for the game, and more importantly, for the memories they had built inside it. Every multiplayer game creates moments, but only a handful create stories. The impossible comeback, the perfectly timed ultimate, that teammate who somehow turned into your best friend, the champion you spent hundreds of hours mastering. For me, it was Vivian, the rival you kept running into every night. Those are things people remember, not patch numbers, not update dates. Memories, and Paladins created a lot of them. Even as the player count slowly declined, the community kept finding reasons to stay. Content creators were still making guides, artists were still drawing fan art, players were organizing tournaments, Discord servers stayed active, people were introducing their friends to the game years after its peak. That doesn't happen by accident. Communities don't survive because a game is perfect. They survive because people believe there's something worth protecting, and that's exactly what made Paladins different. It wasn't being carried by marketing anymore, or esports, or massive update trailers. It was being carried by the people who simply refused to give up on it. In a strange way, Paladins stopped feeling like a live service game. It started feeling like a neighborhood. Everyone knew the problems, everyone complained about the same bugs, everyone joked about the servers, but they also celebrated every new player, every update, every sign that the game still had a future. That's why even today, when there is a rumor, a developer tweet, or someone mentions the possibility of a revival, the community comes back almost instantly. Not because they expect a miracle, but because somewhere deep down, they never stopped hoping. And honestly, I think that's one of the greatest compliments a game can ever receive, because games that are truly forgotten don't inspire hope, they inspire indifference. Paladins never became irrelevant, it became neglected, and those are two very different things. Which brings us to something that happened recently, something that reminded everyone just how much people still cared. For most games, the story ends when the players leave. Developers move on, the servers eventually shut down, and over time, people simply stop talking about them. Paladins never followed that script, because every few months, something strange happens. Someone uploads a video asking what happened to Paladins. Former player decides to reinstall it, a streamer revisits it for the nostalgia, and suddenly, thousands of people who hadn't thought about the game in years start talking about it all over again. That's not normal. Most multiplayer games don't get second chances, yet Paladins seems to get one every single year, and recently we saw it happen again. A creator stepped forward with an ambitious idea to help revive Paladins, and almost immediately the community exploded. Some people were excited, others were skeptical. Some believed it could finally give the game the attention it deserved. Others thought it was simply impossible. The debate itself isn't what's important. Whether that particular attempt succeeds or fails almost misses the point, because the real story is the reaction. Think about it. If nobody cared about Paladins anymore, there wouldn't have been an argument. Nobody would have made videos. Nobody would have written essays. Nobody would have debated whether the game could still be saved. The conversation would have ended years ago, but instead, it came roaring back. Not because Paladins suddenly became the biggest shooter again, but because people never completely let go. And I think that's something the game industry doesn't talk about enough. We often measure game success by player counts, peak concurrents, sale figures, Twitch viewers, but those numbers don't tell the whole story, because influence lasts much longer than popularity. Even today, you can still find people who tell you Bomb King is one of the most creative FPS characters ever designed. But Androxus has some of the smoothest movement in the genre, that no other hero shooter has quite captured what Paladins did with its loadouts and item shop. Those ideas didn't disappear just because the player count got smaller. They're still part of the conversation. And maybe that's why this game refuses to stay buried. Not because it's perfect, not because everyone agrees it deserves to succeed, but because underneath all the bugs, all the missed opportunities, and all the frustration, there was something genuinely worth saving. Which brings us to the final question after everything we've talked about. Can Paladins actually come back, or has the opportunity already passed? So after everything, what actually happened to Paladins? Was it Overwatch? Partly. Competing against Blizzard was always going to be an uphill battle. Was it the bugs? Absolutely. years of technical issues slowly chipped away at players' patience? Was it Hi-Rez? To some extent, there were decisions that frustrated the community, features that disappeared, and opportunities that, looking back, were impossible not to question. But I don't think any one of those things tells the whole story, because if they did, Paladins would have died years earlier. Instead, it survived. It survived Battlebond, it survived Lawbreakers, it survived Gigantic, it even outlived the original version of Overwatch. That isn't what a bad game does. That's what a good game does, even when everything around it is working against it. And maybe that's why so many people still struggle to let it go. Not because Paladins was perfect, it wasn't. Not because it deserved to beat Overwatch, maybe it never could. But because it proved something that very few games ever managed to prove. You don't need the biggest budget, you don't need the biggest marketing campaign, you don't even need the biggest player base. If your game is genuinely fun, people will keep coming back. Sometimes for years, sometimes even after everyone else has moved on. Looking back, I don't think the biggest strategy is that Paladins became smaller. Games rise and games fall. That's the nature of this industry. The real tragedy is that we'll never know what Paladins could have become if the same level of care that went into creating its gameplay had been matched by the same level of investment in its future. Because underneath all the bugs, underneath all the server problems, and underneath every frustrating update, there was a game that players genuinely loved. And I think that's why even today, when people mention Paladins, people don't respond with anger, they respond with nostalgia, with stories, with memories, with one simple sentence that I've seen repeated over and over while making this video. I miss this game. I really do. Maybe that's Paladin's real legacy. Not that it was the game that almost challenged Overwatch, not that it was called a clone, not even that it slowly faded away, but that years later, people still wish it had gotten the chance it deserved. And honestly, there aren't many games you can say that about. So maybe the question was never, why did Paladins die? Maybe the better question is, what if it never really did? If you used to play Paladins, I'd love to hear your story. Who was your main? What's the one memory that still sticks with you? This is a much longer long-form video compared to what I usually make. I'm really glad that I made this type of video on the game that I really loved. And you guys, if you guys did enjoy, you know what to do. Drop a like, subscribe to my channel. Really helps me out a lot, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Let's crank out and move out.